So I think it's fair to say there's a lot of cameras in the Sony Alpha range, right? There's a load of lovely cameras, and some of the latest ones that we took a look at a little bit earlier this year was the a7C II and the a7CR. Two cameras that came out at the same time, quite similar, to be honest, quite similar in the way they look, quite similar in the way they perform, but they are slightly different. So let's talk about which one is right for you and how you can pick between them if you're looking at those cameras. Now, both cameras, like I say, are great, very compact, small, quite stylish as well, but still full frame options. They kind of mimic a little bit the a7 IV, so that's the a7C II, and then the a7R5 with the a7CR, but in that nice, small, compact form factor, mimicking a little bit a kind of APS-C camera, but obviously with the full frame capability. So let's talk quickly about the things they actually share, the things they have in common, get that out of the way. Then we can talk about what makes each one a little bit unique and how you can actually decide which one is going to be right for you. So like I say, they both have the same design, the same look to them. They're incredibly similar to actually look at and to hold as well. Both 526 grams in weight. They both have the new mode dial on the top, which is really nice. They both have the same multi-interface hot shoe, which means you can use things like the newer microphones, which just connect by sliding them on the top. You don't have to connect them with wires and all that kind of stuff, which is great. They both have just the one SD card slot. They both have the same small EVF, the same 3-inch 1.36 million dot LCD touchscreen, and they both use the same battery. Quite impressively as well, they both have the same AI processor that we saw in the a7R5, which gives them access to things like much better AF, much better tracking, and of course auto framing as well, which is this new feature which allows the cameras to film you but actually crop in and follow you as you move around, a little bit like having a camera person behind the camera, which is super useful. Both cameras have that because they both have that AI processor. They both have quite impressive in-body image stabilization as well, so up to 7 stops, which is really good. It feels good in the hands as well. And that's great for not only photography, but for handheld video as well, where it becomes very, very useful. And absolutely, both of these cameras are hybrid cameras. They actually both have some really decent video specs. We'll touch on that in a bit because there are some differences there. But they're both able to shoot 4K 10-bit 422. They both have things like S-Tone, S-Log, and they can both shoot 4K up to 60 frames a second, although there is a slight difference there with the crop, which we'll touch on. And they both do full HD up to 120 frames a second as well. So let's talk a little bit about the differences. Now, the a7C II has a 33 megapixel sensor, where the a7CR has a 61 megapixel sensor. So if that matters to you, the a7CR is definitely the better choice. 33 megapixels for me on the a7C II is still more than enough. That's still a very, very nice resolution, still allows you to crop in post or crop in actually in camera as well. That still gives you some very nice detailed pictures, but it is true. 61 megapixels on the a7CR, which is actually the same sensor as the a7R5, really does give you some extremely lovely images. And, you know, yes, it's true. I think 61 megapixels, probably overkill, probably unnecessary for 99% of the uses that you might use it for, but that doesn't change the fact that it's still very nice to use and it's very nice to play with, and it gives you a lot of leeway when you come to edit for cropping your image. If you're shooting weddings, if you're shooting events, it just allows you a bit more flexibility to shoot a touch wider and be able to reframe, recrop in post, which is always a nice thing. So that's something to consider. The speed as well is something that is a little bit different. So the a7C II can shoot up to 10 frames a second, whereas the a7CR can shoot up to 8 frames a second. Are you going to notice the difference in real life? That depends on what you're shooting. If you're shooting sports and wildlife, then you might be better off with that slightly faster 10 frames a second. You might notice that. In the real world, where you're shooting events and weddings and all kinds of stuff like that, for me, 8 frames a second is still fine. I understand why it's 8 frames a second because it's obviously a much higher megapixel count. It would have been nice to see the 10 frames a second in the a7CR as well, especially considering it's a more expensive camera, but I do kind of get it. So if speed is more important, a7C II, absolutely. But with resolution, we're looking at a7CR. And actually that goes a step further. The a7CR has a pixel multi-shoot mode. Can't remember the actual name, but essentially allows you to take multiple shots and combines them into one for one 240 megapixel image. Now, if you thought 61 megapixels was overkill, we're in a different world now. 240 megapixels. Now, I realistically would probably never have need to use this, but if you are doing, for example, a very high-end product shot or some fine art, or maybe it's architecture and you need an incredible amount of detail, fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. And it's nice to have that option in camera, whereas you don't have that on the a7C II. Now, I mentioned both cameras are definitely hybrid cameras as well. So let's jump into the world of video. Both cameras can shoot 4K up to 60 frames a second, but how they get there is a little bit different. So with the a7C II, 4K up to 30 frames a second is shot completely full frame. No crop, all good. You want to shoot 4K 60, you're going to be shooting in crop mode, so that's a 1.5 times crop for the 4K 60. Not ideal, not the end of the world. Sometimes it actually allows you to get a little bit more reach, but that depends on how you want to use the camera. The a7CR can shoot 4K up to 60 frames a second, and across all those frame rates, it is going to be a 1.2 times crop. So just a little bit of a crop, but all the way across all those different frame rates. Whereas the a7C II, if I was shooting like this with the a7C II, no crop. Whereas the a7CR, yes, crop. But if I want slow motion, more of a crop on the a7C II. A little bit complicated, but I think we get it. Now we're about to get even a little bit more complicated here because the 4K itself is slightly different. On the a7C II, that 4K up to 30 frames a second is oversampled from 7K, which means it is just higher detail. It's a better quality 4K, which means it looks a little bit more detailed. It looks a little bit better. It's just a better quality 4K image. Whereas on the a7CR, it's oversampled from 6.2K, which is still decent, but it just means there's a slight difference in the end quality of the video. Are you going to notice it realistically in the real world? Probably not, but it's worth being aware of. This is where it gets just a touch more complicated, because on the a7C II, that is only true up to 30 frames a second, because once you go up to 60 frames a second, you are now in crop mode, so it's just a straight 4K. So there's ups and downs in the video for both cameras. However, the a7CR is also capable of outputting raw video via the HDMI, which the a7C II can't do. So if that's something that you like to do, if that's something that's important to you, even if you only do it now and then, the a7CR is going to be the obvious choice. Also worth mentioning that while both cameras can use the optional grip to go on the bottom where maybe your little finger might want to rest, the a7CR actually comes with it, which is nice, whereas the a7C II, that would be an optional extra to actually purchase. I didn't feel like I needed it on the camera, and I've got quite big hands, but if you feel like that's something that's going to make it more comfortable for you, worth noting, the a7CR comes with it, a7C II, you're going to need to actually buy it. So, okay, let's sum this up. How would you pick between the two? How would you choose which one's right for you? Well, there's two big parts to this, I think. First of all, the a7C II is the cheaper option. It is just less expensive, and that is really important, especially with kind of what you'd call, I guess, a mid-range camera like this. They're very, very capable cameras, but they're sitting below the sort of high-end stuff like the A1. And price does play an important role, and these two cameras are so very, very similar that this is an important thing to consider when weighing it up. I think on paper, outside of things like the slightly slower speed for continuous shooting, the a7CR is probably technically the better camera. But with that said, I think the a7C II possibly offers more from a value perspective. And I think from actually noticing things in the real world, in real world usage, I don't know that you're going to really notice loads more with the a7CR unless you are much more photography minded, in which case you will definitely notice the 61 megapixel sensor. Even if you wanted to crop actually in camera, you could still just have a 26 megapixel image, which is still quite a nice amount of detail in your image, but you really just have more flexibility with that file size. So if you're more photography minded, I think the a7CR is going to really be great. And if you're a bit more technical with the video as well, you might get more out of the a7CR. But if you want just a nice all-rounder, compact, lightweight, stylish camera, the a7C II offers some great value and a really, really lovely hybrid camera in that system. I would be happy with either of these cameras. They're both very, very lovely. But hopefully that helps a little bit with deciding which one might be right for you. You can check out both cameras, including the full spec, everything you might want to know, by following the links down in the description. Don't forget to like and subscribe as well. There's new content all the time. I'll see you next time. But until then, as always, thanks for watching.